Professor Marandi, with the case of Israel and the way that the Arab states see Israel, I think somehow the attack on Doha has changed a lot of calculations on the part of the Arab states. Are they still in panic? Are they still, do they really feel that Israel would attack them any moment, anytime they want to attack them? And who's going to be the United States in that, that sort of policy on the part of Israelis?
I don't think they feel that it could happen at any time or any day, but I think they feel very vulnerable. And in the case of Qatar, we saw basically the prime minister of Qatar in his interview with Tucker Carlson admit that, and we knew this, of course, before, but the only reason why Hamas is in Qatar is because the Americans and the Israeli regime wanted them there. And he admitted that this took place like 12, 13 years ago. When was this? It was when Hamas, the political wing, started having differences with the Syrian government. And there was a split. So the Americans and the Israelis wanted Hamas out of Syria. They wanted the axis of resistance weakened. And Qatar, being a very pro American entity, which, as the prime minister of Qatar pointed out, they did all these, whatever money they sent to Gaza was in full coordination with Mossad and with Israeli intelligence and the government and the different prime ministers. So Qatar is not a pro resistance government. The only people who think that are on the payroll. And they have lots of people on the payroll, different media channels, not just their own, but I know TV channels that are funded by Qatar, which are not necessarily known to be Qatari. I know that they fund media in Turkey. They fund media in the UK. They have so-called cultural and Islamic centers funded across the region and in Lebanon. And I visited one in Lebanon with a very, very deeply sectarian uh, cleric leading it, who was very ignorant about the resistance and about Hezbollah and about ideologically speaking, even though he was just 2, 3 miles or 4 or 5 kilometers away from. Well, anyway, so he was in Beirut. So if those on the payroll, obviously they're going to be forced to take a particular stance. But in reality, it's clear when we see, even again, we see how, like in last night in Lebanon, the supporters of Jolani went to the streets. They didn't go to the streets to protest against the Israeli regime's incursion in Lebanon. They went to the streets to intimidate the resistance. I mean, their numbers were small compared to the supporters of the resistance, but the point is that Qatar, Erdogan, the regime in Syria, and other regional regimes, they are not pro-resistance, and Qatar in particular, I think it doesn't fear any imminent attack, but it does want ordinary Americans to recognize that, look, we are very much in your camp. This is their response to the threats. And I think that's the same is true in the other countries in the Persian Gulf region that are in the American camp. Instead of rethinking their policies and saying, look, we shouldn't put all our eggs in the American camp, in the American basket. We should diversify. We should be talking to Iran, God forbid, or China or Russia, and 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 decrease U.S. leverage over us. They do the opposite. So the prime minister of Qatar basically admits that, look, we have Hamas here since you wanted us to do so.
Professor, how do you see Russia and China in the Middle East? Do you think that they can bring some sort of balance to the American power in the Middle East?
Russia doesn't have that sort of capability. It has its hands full in Ukraine anyway. China is obviously a growing power. But I don't think China really has the sort of, the West has hundreds of years of experience in global hegemony, in colonization, and neo-colonialism, and uh, they are very influential. But leaders across the world, and I don't just mean presidents and prime ministers and kings and despots and so on, but I mean the elites across the world. It's been tradition for them to go to the United States, to the Europe, for education. They send their families, major business people. Many of these, USAID, many of these scholarships from these different foundations, when they say we gave, let's say, $10 million for scholarships in this region of Africa or Latin America or Asia, they're not choosing ordinary people to go to the United States so that they can get a better education. They're basically giving them to the families of elites, those people who will be governing, and who will be under their thumb in the years ahead, in the decades ahead. So the West has been well established across the globe for a very long period of time. The United States today, of course, being the dominant hegemon. China does not have that experience, for good or for ill. It doesn't have to be something suspect or something sinister. But in general, China doesn't have that long term presence across the globe where it can engage in a way in which would be more influential, or it could have the sort of influence that you're talking about. So Russia, but the thing is that a lot of these countries in the Persian Gulf region that are bound to the West, and even now when they want to buy new weapons to protect themselves against the Israeli regime, what weapons do they buy? They go and buy American weapons. But ultimately, the Americans know best how to counter their own weapons. So they're not doing themselves any service. They're just, giving bribes basically to the Americans and kickbacks to God knows who. But since they do have a wealth, if they wanted to build stronger bridges between themselves and Moscow or Tehran or Beijing, they could do so. They could create leverage for themselves, but I don't think they would ever seriously contemplate such a thing. Any of them.
Yeah. The case of Gaza, Professor Marandi, the first step was not implemented, in its totality, but they're talking about the second phase and the third. Netanyahu said that the second step would be, disarmament, and the third would be de-radicalization of Gaza. How do you think that he's putting out something impossible in order to, to sabotage the whole talk? We know that this sort of peace talks are not sincere on the part of the United States and the president of the United States. But after all, how do you see the behavior of the Israeli government?
When the Israelis speak about de-radicalization, the first thing that comes to mind is Amalek. They're they consider Palestinians to be subhuman. They consider the Lebanese to be subhuman. They consider everyone to be subhuman. They consider themselves to be a master race, a chosen people. The only people who need to be de-radicalized are the Zionists and those who've been brought to power by Zionists, like the Takfiris. I mean, these groups that the Western intelligence agencies have, like ISIS and Al Qaeda and Boko Haram and all these other these that have been funded by the West or Western proxies like Qatar and other oil and gas rich regimes. They're the ones that have to be de-radicalized. They're the ones who consider others as worthy of death if they don't either think like them in the case of these takfiris, or if they're not of their race or their ethnicity like Zionists. But this so-called peace plan was never serious. And the very fact that phase two and phase three are very vague, and there's no clear relationship between phase one and phase two, is makes it obvious they knew that this was never going to get anywhere. And phase one, even that has not been fulfilled in any meaningful way. We're having massacres taking place daily and regularly in Gaza. One day it's 5 people, one day it's 7 people, one day it's 15 people, one day it's 20 people. Well, they gunned down. They gunned down. I think yesterday a 3-year-old kid, girl, playing outside her tent. Uh, but this is not something that the West cares about. Western journalists care about, mainstream journalists, or mainstream media journalists, or Western politicians or Western diplomats. They're pretending that this is a ceasefire, and that's what Trump said it 2 3 days ago. Yet that we have peace. It's not peace. But since Palestinian lives are you know not worth anything to them, it doesn't matter. And Zionists and their allies consider them to be Amalek. So for the BBC, they're Amalek. For CNN, they're Amalek. For the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News, the Guardian, they're all Amalek. Every now and then the narrative is clear, and it's clear where they all stand. It's only when they're under duress in the public opinion through social media, despite all the censorship, is completely outraged. Do some of these media outlets let some information get through? So I don't see this ceasefire, this so-called ceasefire, getting anywhere. Ultimately, this is going to lead to conflict. Netanyahu has no plan to retreat from Gaza. Most of Gaza is now controlled by the Israeli regime. The yellow line is a vague line where they're constantly killing kids and pretending that they're a threat because they like killing, because they have a bloodlust. I mean, does anyone believe that the Israeli snipers don't know the difference between a 3-year-old kid and a 20-year-old armed man? Of course not. But no one is going to get punished because it's acceptable behavior in the West when it comes to Israel. So no, we're not going to get anywhere with the ceasefire. They're going to continue putting pressure on ordinary Palestinians. That they're not allowing aid to get in. They're not allowing reconstruction to take place. Children are dying. People are dying of cancer, of disease, of the injuries that they sustained during the genocide, which is ongoing. But they're not allowed to go to hospital, and supplies are not being allowed to get in. So this is just a horrific situation that will continue until ultimately it collapses. Obviously, Hamas and Jihad and Islamic Jihad, they are preparing themselves for the next phase, and so is the Israeli regime, which is getting huge amounts of, you know, huge amounts of aid from the West. When the German chancellor went to Palestine the other day, it was when he was in Israel that 3-year-old girl was gunned down, but he didn't say anything about it. He doesn't care.